Hello, and thank you for the invitation to say a few words about the relationship between text and maps, how maps can be based on text, and hopefully opening up for some questions and discussions afterwards through a reflection, so to speak, on the room between production and reflection. My name is Øyvind Eide. I am a professor in digital humanities at the University of Cologne. In his novel The Unconsoled from 1995, Ishiguro describes in chapter 10 specific travel from a house, his hotel in the city, to a dinner and with some things happening afterwards. This is a preliminary study where I have looked into how the things are described and how a map can or cannot be used in order to understand how the spatial movements in a real world happens. So this novel is, as said, a surreal one, describing a dreamlike reality in which people are fluid. Whether somebody is a stranger or a family member varies throughout the text, and the spaces are equally dreamlike. And the idea is to express the media product of a text, in this case chapter 10, in a different medium and thinking about how to do this media transformation in order to understand something more about the text. So, in this travel, in the chapter 10, the protagonist, concert piano player, going to a Central European city to perform a concert, is taken from the hotel in the city where he's living. He's actually just taking a nap, so he's doing this in his dressing gown, through the city by car for a fairly long time in queue, and then out in the countryside and traveling for a fairly long time, 30 minutes, 20 minutes, 30, 40, until they arrive at the country house for dinner. At the end of this chapter, it turns out that the country house is the same place as the hotel in the city, in the sense that looking to the far end of the big dining hall, he realizes that the passage going from there leads into the reception of the hotel. And this somewhat surprising fact can then be interpreted in different ways. It could be seen as a travel in circle. So the travel in the countryside ends up actually close to the hotel. The text in general clearly makes this impossible. It could be a transformation from one place to another, and it could be an expression of what you can call a non-geometrical, non-real space. For instance, that the dining room is in two buildings at the same time, or that distances are not coherent. So, in order to distinguish between these possibilities, what is actually said at a moment where the realization of the fact that he can get to the hotel with a few minutes walk appears to the protagonist. I'm very tired now too, Stephen said. I'll walk back with you. Walk back? Yes, I'm going to sleep in one of the rooms tonight. I often do that if I'm on duty in the morning. So this is the son of the hotel director, and he's also working in the hotel. For a moment his words continued to puzzle me. Then, as I looked past the clusters of standing and seated dinner guests, past waiters and the tables, to where the vast room disappeared into darkness, it suddenly dawned to me that we were in the atrium of the hotel. I had not recognized it because earlier in the day I had entered it and had viewed it from the opposite end. Somewhere in the darkness, on the far side, would be the bar where I had drunk my coffee and planned the day ahead. I had no chance to dwell on this realization, however, for Stephen was leading me away with surprising insistence. So, we see here that travel in circle doesn't make any sense, partly also because the way the travel was described, as mentioned. And a transformation from one place to another is also clearly rejected by a normal reading of the text. So we see here sort of a non-geometrical, non-real space, which can be more abstractly expressed as the length from A to B is not equal to the length from B to A. So going in one direction has a different length than going in the other direction, which is expressible in a text, but not mappable. So what we are seeing here is that trying to think in a visual way, in a spatial map way, shows us what is not really surprising, that this text is absurd, spatially incoherent, and not mappable. So this is true. On the other hand, what we usually do when we map texts is that we either quantitatively or qualitatively, either based on close reading or distant reading, I would not go into a deeper discussion of these concepts, it's done several times in other settings. Through these methods, we detect place references. What we specifically do is to find a reference in a text which co-refers to a place on a map, which also refers to some place in a third system, which could be what we call reality, the real world, but it could also be a coherent, consistent understanding of a fictional world. So these place names are then detected. It can be place names, it can also be other referring string, such as 3 miles down the river from the bridge, and some coordinates are found for each place reference, and these can then be put on a pre-existing map. This is a normal methodology, putting it onto the map. It's also possible to create a new map for these data coming from the text only. This latter method is usually used in more experimental settings. The map can be of a real or fictitious world. As mentioned, what usually happens is that a new map layer is created. So this methodology is surely not uncritical, but it's much more goal-oriented than we saw in the Ishiguro example before. And the point here is that a lot of practice and theoretical reflections can be found in the span between these 2 points. Aesthetic rules are obviously productive, and they can be used for effects. Media differences are also productive and can create a certain level of tension. And what I'm aiming at here is that there are fundamental media differences leading to fundamental differences in aesthetic rules, as pointed out in intermedia studies, in art, poetry comparisons, and so on. There is a certain level of tension which, for instance, is based on the fact that maps are symmetric. That means A to B equals B to A, whereas texts are not necessarily so. There are different rules for negation and disjunctions, as we will see in a second. And the point here is that when we create a text based on a map, it's not a map of the space of the text, but it's a map of the space of reading of the text. That means that what we are actually mapping is the landscape as it is created by the reader in the reading process. The text and the paratext surely gives cues, instructions, and so on to how this happens, but the creative process performed by the reader is fundamental. Also, when the reader is using a computer to accomplish the task through statistical methods, identity recognition, geocoding, and so on. And the point here that not only that maps can be used for deforming texts, but they have to, because the map you end up with depends on the reading you do of the text. Different texts and different project goals, of course, leads to the use of different tools and different methodologies. In some cases, we want to have a basic overview of the space of the text, so to speak. In other cases, we want to really go into a deeper understanding of what's happening in the text, how things are created. Fundamental to this is that texts in general have a high level of underspecification, which will have to be filled in by the reader to the degree that the kind of things we saw in the Ishiguro example are actually not that common, because we can usually establish a coherent understanding of the space we read out of the text and express it on a map, because we have a fair amount of freedom in this, which means we have to make choices. I will come back to that. So just to make this very, very clear at a very basic level, when you look at a text like this, the spatial relationship between Oxford and London we will use in text mapping is not based on the fact that London is down and to the right of Oxford and thereby southeast of Oxford. The meaning we use in the space mapping, text mapping, is reading the sentence or the part of the sentence towards the morning sun, indicating that London is east of Oxford. On the other hand, if we put this on a graphical form which looks like a map, the fact that London is to the right of Oxford would, in our modern, very common idea that maps tend to have north in the top, lead to an understanding that London is east of Oxford, whereas Cambridge is northwest of London. So the point is here that we have to understand the process from text to map as a process through the understanding of the text into a re-establishment of that understanding in a different media. So it's a media transformation. And in this transformation, there's a fundamental change in level of specification, how it can be expressed. B is northeast of A, can express a number of different readings, whereas when you put it out in a geometry, a map, or another visual form, these things have exact geographical spatial coordinates. Then you can say B can be a fuzzy object with fuzzy edges, which is true, but on the other hand, then B will have edges, borders of this fuzzy area. So the point here is that we talk about two different ways of expressing things, two types of media. I will not go into media definitions here, that's a big topic in itself. Two types of media, basic media called text and maps. And these both have their advantages, and they can express their stories in different ways. It tends to be the fact that geographical features on maps tend to be seen as true and stable, whereas stories tend to be seen as more fluctuating. A map, in the sense I'm talking about them here, which is these graphical representations of some external system based on a rule system, is bound to this two-dimensional or 2.5-dimensional structure, whereas the textual expression is freer, for instance, to express contradictory and geometrically inconsistent facts. And what we see is that different media, in general, not only text and maps, can express fundamentally different images of the world. And that also means, as we know from intermedia studies and from media transformation, that an expression based on another expression in another medium will always be an interpretation partly steered by the target medium. The medium is not the message, but the medium surely influences the message, or as Elleström said, every medium has the capacity of mediating only certain aspects of the total reality, and as these aspects are different, the media transformation means that things are expressed in a different way, which in many cases also leads to what can be expressed being different. So how does this relate to modeling? Well, the map is a model. Modeling in digital humanities include purposes such as making things, understanding things, teaching, making implicit information explicit. It includes areas such as data modeling. I will focus here on the basis for modeling in digital humanities, which tends to be media products. Not always, there are also other objects and structures, but when we create models in digital humanities, it's often based on things like text collections, music, paintings, and so on. We base the idea of modeling on an idea which is comparable to scientific modeling, which is a fairly well-developed area and discussed thoroughly in the philosophy of science, but there is also a long modeling tradition in the humanities, which I will not go into today. The models themselves are mediated, so we are not focusing on mind models, but models expressed in an external medium. Whether mind models are also mediated is a different question, which I will not go into. These models are dynamic, always dynamic. Creating and using a model is always a dynamic process, but they're not always dynamic in form, in the sense that they can be modified. They are always dynamic in creation and use. So therefore, we are talking about modeling as a process more than model as the base concept. There is a complex relationship between a map and a terrain, between the model and its targets, between models and their targets. Traditionally, in the sciences and in philosophy of science, this was not really discussed that much. It was seen as a fairly uncomplex, straightforward representational system, some sort of isomorphism, other ideas about it, but it hasn't been discussed that much until the last decades, in a period in which an idea of pragmatic modeling has grown, where somebody is creating a model of something with some purpose. This has also made its way into digital humanities the last 10-15 years, where these pragmatic models is then seen as something mediated between theory and the physical world, almost some sort of autonomous agents. Long discussion possible about models. I will jump back to maps. So, maps can then be seen as a type of models. Here is an example to make some basic points about how this works. Talbot, in his book about Roman portable sundials, uses the list on the back of these portable time measurement objects in which places and coordinates are listed. In order to be able to use the artifacts, you have to know where you are in order to use a sundial. And if it's portable, it means you have to know where you are at the time you're using it, which might be different from the previous time. So this is a map of a number of these places, and the arrows show the order in which they are listed. So it's a modeling of a listing of place names. Well, yes it is, but it's also modeling an interpretation of a listing of these place names, because, for instance, the coordinates used here is based on identification of the place name and a mapping to modern coordinates. So again, the point is we make some choices about how to make these maps. We create, as scholars, these maps with a certain purpose. This kind of modeling, including map-based modeling, is also a learning strategy where we teach it in Cologne as part of our practical exercises in study programs. This means also that we're making clear that there is a relationship between theory and modeling, which of course by themselves are different, and implementation, as in systems made, creating software, making maps based on text, and so on, where the theories and the models we make clearly influence the implementation, but implementation also leads to new understanding and further development of theory and of modeling and of our thinking around both. So it's not only a practice-based theory, but also a theoretical-based practice in which modeling is playing a fundamental role. So, what I'm talking about here is the impossible act of mapping. And the reason why I call it impossible is that creating the map of a text is impossible. Because mapping of texts is a pragmatic modeling process, where somebody makes the model, the map, with a certain purpose. So there's a subjective part of this. The map will always present an interpretation. So there will always be a possibility of making other maps. On the other hand, we need scholarly reproducibility. So of course we need to describe our methodology, our sources, how we do things, the choices made, and so on. But it's also often useful to create a multiple set of maps, create different maps based on different possible interpretations, making clear the point that these maps are not the map of something. Could also, of course, be complex maps with multiple interpretations readable from the same interactive map. And we need to be able to trace our arguments and make the process as open as possible. And in order to get further in this double view on map making based on text as a practical research methodology and as a critical way to explore media differences, we do need further experiments in how we use map symbols, how we express the multitude of possible readings, and how the dynamic aspects of maps can be used in this process. So thank you a lot for the invitation. I'm really curious about this format, and I'm looking forward to interesting questions to bring this discussion further, and hopefully it will at some point in the future also lead to some enriching face-to-face meetings. Thank you.